Okay. So where we left off last week, we were talking about um, we talked about the tour, the Balaturim, that he set up the four sections of the tour. Made a notice that somebody named Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote something called the Beit Yosef as a commentary. I said before we can really talk about the Beit Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, we have to go back in time leading up to him. We went back to the expulsion of the Jews from England. Tonight, we're going to talk about a more well-known time period, which is the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And in order to do that, we also have to do a little bit of digging into history. Let me get something here on the screen that I need. And here's this. Okay. I'll put a map on the screen in a few minutes, but right now, actually, let me start up with that might be helpful just to get an idea of where we're talking about here. What we know today as Portugal here on the left side, the western part of what's called the Iberian Peninsula, and this area here, which is today known as Spain, was multiple kingdoms until 1492, which we're going to talk about that. Something called the Reconquista, which was the reconquering of the land. And have a little patience, we're going to get to it in a couple minutes. But was the kingdom of Castile over here. You had the kingdom of Granada here. Aragon. Aragon is famous for something that we haven't talked about, which was the famous disputation between the Ramban and the king and the church, actually, through the king of Aragon in the time of the Ramban. And Portugal is still Portugal. It was known as a kingdom. And what happens is the Reconquista, this becomes what we know as Spain and Portugal. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. We're going to come back to these maps in a little while.
Maps are very helpful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I find that, a lot of people really just can't picture geography in general, and where's Europe relative to Asia or something. So it's good. It helps as well. So in order to understand the time period we're coming into, we want to start at the end for a minute, and that is that in 1492, and there is a connection between Columbus and this expulsion of the Jews, which we'll get to possibly still tonight. That in 1492, the Christian kingdom of Castile and Aragon conquer Granada. It ends 800 years of Muslim rule in the south, and they found what is now known today as Spain. That war, that conquering, was called the Reconquista, which is the reconquering of the land. Now, why is that important? We'll have to see. But that's kind of the end of the story. So if you just did a little bit of math in your head, you will know that, let's see, in 1492, Spain was founded, and in 1492, they threw the Jews out. Well, it didn't happen overnight. So there's the whole process that led to this. So as far as I'm going to do similar to what we did last week when it came to England, I'm going to go back a little bit in time. I'm going to go back a couple of centuries before the actual expulsion of the Jews. They lived in Spain. I'm going to call it Spain, even though it wasn't called Spain at the time, known as Sfarad. The Gemara refers to it as Aspamia, pretty much from the Roman times. They lived under all kinds of rules, the Muslims, the Christians, the Visigoths, a whole bunch of different people. They were mostly under Muslim rule from the 8th through the 11th centuries. Now, if you remember some past classes, you know that we're talking about the time period of the Gaonim. So it kind of like put a little parallels here that we're talking about the Gaonic period, which we talked about months ago. And during this time period, the Gaonic period, the Jews are living under Muslim rule in what was today modern day Spain. And at that time is the early days and leading up to the birth of what becomes the Golden Age of Spain, which we talked about. All the different people, as Ibn Ezra and the Rambam and others. And we talked about those in other classes. When they come under Christian rule, the Jewish communities are tolerated. They're tolerated for one reason, and they're tolerated for the same reason they were tolerated in England, and that is economic purposes, administrative skills, abilities to bank, abilities to loan money, They became financiers. Yes, Jewish money is running the world, obviously. Just, all we need is a picture of a guy with a hooked nose right now sitting on a bag of cash. But they also became scapegoats. That whenever there was any economic unrest, political unrest, economic downturns, immediately it was the Jews who were blamed. Again, like I said, I know I've said this over and over, but it's true. This is the same story that keeps repeating itself. Just it's a different day, same stuff. But what really led up to the expulsion of the Jews in 1492? It's not like Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, who then merged their dynasties, just threw the Jews out on day one, which almost they did, but there had to be something that led up to it. About 100 years before this is starting, before the Jews are thrown out, there is a lot of anti-Semitic actions, violence. It's instead of it being on the campuses and in the streets of Toronto, Los Angeles, and Miami and others, it's happening throughout Spain. Again, when I say Spain, keep in mind it's not officially Spain yet. Just to give you the frame of reference. And especially there was actually a pogrom, a very serious pogrom in 1391. So about 100 years before the Jews are kicked out of Spain. Already there's a very serious pogrom in Spain, devastating the Jewish communities across the country. That's the one aspect. Another aspect is something which we saw a little bit of already in England, and that's forced conversions. Forced conversions were basically were told, listen, you're Jewish. We don't want you to be Jewish. Remember, we're under Christian rule now. And unlike today, where the church doesn't have power to enforce anything beyond the church itself for the most part, in this time period of history, whether it was France or England or Spain or wherever is under the rubric of the church, they have tremendous control over the country, starting with the king. And the king is considered a representative of the church. In any case, Jews were given a choice: convert or die. Sometimes convert or leave, which we'll see, but they were also given convert or die. And what happened? There were Jews who decided to convert outwardly, but inwardly in their homes and in private and secret, they decided they were going to remain Jewish. They became known back then as either new Christians or conversos, meaning converts, or another word which has thankfully fallen out of use. When I was growing up, this is what they were called: marranos. Marranos means pigs. They're called pigs. Obviously, those who have modern day, which we'll talk about, who have come through the ranks and just discovered their Jewishness and their history, would obviously be preferred being called conversos, converts, or as opposed to marranos, meaning pigs. At the same time, though, even though they did outwardly convert, and even though in the streets they lived as Christians, the average Christian in the street still looked at these Jews, in quotes, with resentment, skepticism, and they accused them of practicing a secret practice of Judaism. Would call them crypto Jews. Crypto's in secret, like in hiding inside. So they were told to be crypto Jews. So you have this group of Jews who they're really stuck. If they decide to just remain Jewish, if it's a peril of their life. By the way, in parentheses, halachically, there's a whole halachic issue with that, which I'm not going to get into right now. But in general terms, if it's convert to Christianity or die, you die. But right now, we're not going to get into the halachic aspect of that. But you have them. They're becoming outwardly Christian and secretly practicing Judaism. The average Christian on the street is looking at them with suspicion. They're referring to them in a very derogatory term, and they're resenting them. They're accusing them of practicing Judaism secretly, which was true. In addition to that, their fellow Jews looked at them with disdain. How dare you convert? Before we continue and talk about what then continued to grow and grow up to the actual expulsion of the Jews, let's talk for a few minutes about this topic: crypto Jews, conversos, because up till this very day, it has implications. Now, if you don't know at all what I'm talking about, let me give you a little bit of an example from modern times. This is true very much in the desert southwest of the United States, where as recently as now, people who have grown up their whole lives living lives as Christians have begun to discover that they have Jewish roots that go all the way back to this exact time period. What happened? Let's fast forward after these Jews are being forced underground, outwardly Christian, secretly Jewish. 1, 2, 3, 4 generations later, there's no more secret Jewish stuff and just public Christian. It's because they become Christian. However, what they found on headstones of some of their Christian family members, again, especially in the desert southwest of the United States, they'll find certain Jewish symbols, maybe a little menorah or a little of this with a Kohen or some other symbol. But what was like the one thing that seems to have survived literally centuries is that, and I actually heard a woman speak about this, a converso in Chicago many years ago. It's at least 20 years ago that I heard her, but it made a tremendous impact. She said when she was growing up, they had a custom. They were Christian. They went to Christian. They went to mass. They went to church. They celebrated Christmas and everything. But they had a tradition that on Friday night, they would go downstairs in their basement and light 2 candles. She never knew why. And this, by the way, seems to be one of the common denominators on all these people who are discovering in the past, I'll make up a number, I don't know, 50 years, 75 years, they're discovering they have Jewish roots that go back to prior to the expulsion of Jews from Spain. Why they're lighting them? Because there was originally the hidden Jews, conversos, crypto Jews. What were they doing? They couldn't light their Shabbat candles on their table. What happens if their Christian neighbor comes in the house? What if a Christian comes to check and see are they really, really living up to what they promised? So what do? They went downstairs in their basement or wherever they could go somewhere in hiding, and they lit their Shabbat candles. This way they were able to perpetuate their Jewish life, at least to some degree, on a Friday night. So let's come back now to this a little bit of background on the crypto Jews. Again, when I say crypto Jews, conversos, Marranos, crypto Jews, secret Jews, all the same. They again are the ones who publicly professed. So Judy said, see, she says, we have a close friend who was Catholic until she discovered she was Jewish. This, by the way, can be from a converso story, but there's what happens much more than that. And I heard the stories with my own ears. I went many times to Europe from Chicago, rabbinic trips, where we would go to Jewish communities in Europe, see how the money that was raised by Federation in the United States was helping these people. And then we would come to Israel afterwards. And so I had a chance to go to many communities in Eastern Europe with zero exception, meaning every single city we went to, whether it was in Prague, whether it was in cities in Poland, cities in Ukraine, cities, wherever we went. And we were talking, we always would meet with the local Jewish community, sometimes the elders, sometimes teenagers, sometimes those in their 30s. Every single community we met, I can't tell you, but a big percentage, every time we met people who were in their 20s and 30s, they only had discovered their Jewish roots within the past couple of years. Why? It was because their grandmother or their grandfather's on their deathbed, and they said they have a secret they've been holding their whole lives and said that you're Jewish. And this happened over and over and over and over. It was a common thread. So the idea that we're talking now about the secret Jews or the crypto Jews is in the context right now only of the lead up to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And then over the centuries, these Jews who are discovering that they actually are descendants of those people. But this is a different story. The people who kept their Jewishness secret, you can't blame them. You're talking about, in the light of the late 1800s, all the massacres of Jews and the pogroms and everything else. So they went underground and just didn't practice any religion, or maybe they were practicing Christians. But I cannot tell you, it was the first time I heard it, I said, wow, that's got to be kind of rare. And every single country we went to, when you talk to these teens and 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds, many of them had only found out in the last few years they were Jewish because someone elderly in their family passed away and told them. Now, so let's come back now to approximately 1392. Okay, let's just go back 100 years before the actual expulsion. So they had to profess fealty to Christianity, again, under duress and coercion, while secretly maintaining their practice, their beliefs. This continued during the Middle Ages. It continued, as I say, up to this days, and that term refers to the Jews, crypto Jews, who converted to Christianity, especially during the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal. I haven't talked about the Inquisition yet. We will still tonight, Bezrat Hashem. It included some of the parts of the Islamic world and other parts of Europe that they maintained their Jewishness in secret. Probably the most significant growth of crypto Judaism happened in Spain. That by the 14th century, again, like they say, about 100 years before the expulsion of the Jews, there were thousands who were killed because they didn't accept Christianity, or they became these people who became the new Christians slash conversos. But let's talk now about the Inquisition. So now, as you start having in the late 14th century, you start having the Jews being forcibly converted or executed. And that's in the late 1390s. We're going to go forward a bunch of years to the mid to the late 1400s. Now we'll talk about 1478 was when the beginning of what was known as the Spanish Inquisition. That Inquisition, its purpose, there was a man named Torquemada, who was, every generation has their Hitler. He was their Hitler. Torquemada, the goal of the Inquisition was to discover who was really Christian, who wasn't. If you were Christian, you were with us. If you were not Christian, you're dead meat. Also, as you may or may not know, I think we learned this also when we did Kuzari, for those of you who were in the class. It was pointed out that Judaism is the only religion that I know of, that he mentioned, on earth, that says that if you don't follow my religion, you still have a place and a reward in heaven. Every other religion, if you're not a Muslim, as far as they're concerned, we're infidels, we're straight to Gehenna. If you're not Christian, we have no chance for redemption. We have no chance of going to heaven. Not going to happen. We believe in the concept of righteous Gentiles. So here, the purpose of the Inquisition is to decide, are you going to the left or are you going to the right? I mean, again, I'm putting that in context of Nazi Germany for a reason, because when we got to the Holocaust, and we talk about the Holocaust, the Shoah, you're going to see that so much of what's been happening a few centuries before the Shoah is already happening. What happens in the Shoah happens a few centuries before. So the Inquisition first starts out to target, wait for it, those Jews who say they converted. They were really being put to the test. What would they do? What would the Inquisition discover? How would they do it? Well, let's see. If the person still avoided working on Shabbat, if they avoided eating pork, if they somehow were doing anything, any way, shape, or form to celebrate a Jewish holiday, they were tortured. There was execution, torture was part of their tools. There was something called the auto de fe, which was the show of faith, where they would be burned at the stake if they basically failed. I'm kind of cramming a whole concept into one sentence. It's not fair, but I don't want to get to the whole thing now. But they were imprisoned, they were tortured. It was a horrible, horrible time period for the Jews. The expulsion, which we're going to expand on in a few minutes, but just right now is just like a bullet, which is in 1492. The monarchs, both King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, they issue an edict of expulsion for the Jewish people. They will force them, the unconverted Jews. They're at this point now, during the middle, because the Inquisition continues on for a very long time after Jews are thrown out. But at this point, they're given the option to be forced out of the country. So they have convert and stay here fine, convert and be discovered that you haven't converted and you get executed, or we're throwing you out of the country. So there's multiple things happening at the same time. And when the kingdoms of Ferdinand and Isabella come together, That is when everything comes to a boiling point, and the Jews are forced away. Again, I'm going to show you a map in a little while of where they go to and all. But what's important for us to understand here is one significant piece of information. I said I'd mention Christopher Columbus because most Americans, myself included, grow up hearing in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It's true. It's fine, very nice, but they don't grow up learning in 1492 the Jews got thrown out of Spain too. What's the connection between them? I mentioned last week that the edict of expulsion of the Jews from England came out on the third day of Av, the month of Av. The Jews, the date that they are actually pushed out in the water into go like goodbye. Again, we'll see soon where they go. Was Tisha B'av. It was actually Tisha B'av. And what was that date supposed to be? That was the date that was supposed to be the date upon which Christopher Columbus was supposed to sail with his 3 ships for the New World. And he was unable to sail because the docks, the ports rather, were filled with boats kicking Jews out of the country. And I have never seen it in writing, but I have heard from many sources that that date that he was supposed to sail, he wrote in his journal, his diary, that today's the day we're supposed to sail, but we're unable to because the ports are filled with Jews being thrown out. So there is a confluence between Christopher Columbus and the Jews being thrown out. The irony is that putting aside all the anti-Semitism today and putting aside everything else, for the most part, the United States, which is the country he ends up discovering part of the New World, becomes a safe haven for the Jewish people who flee persecution and come to, and they formed the original 13 colonies. And you know a little bit of American history, I'm sure. So they came. Now, I'm not saying life was great for them, but it was definitely better than when they're running from. And on top of that, we know that Moshe Feinstein Zatzal writes in many of his responsa. He refers to the United States as a country of chesed. Okay, when I say that today, I have a feeling about America today and what's going on there. Obviously, things have changed radically. Okay, but the point is that it's ironic that here he is. He's trying to go to discover again. He doesn't know it's America, named for Amerigo Vespucci, but he doesn't know that it's America. He's going to the New World, but the Jews can't get out. He can't get out because the Jews are being forced out. Anti-Semitism, convert or die or get out of our country. And eventually, with the land he becomes associated with, the United States of America, it becomes the land in which the Jews find safe haven. So it's a little bit of interesting circle here. So now, with all this background on just a little bit of the conversos and a very brief snippet of the Inquisition, now we have to start talking about the rise, going back again, the rise of anti-Jewish sentiment. Why are we doing all this again? Besides the fact it's part of the history of the Jews, because in order to understand Rabbi Yosef Karo and the birth of the Shulchan Aruch, we have to understand where he comes from. And obviously he comes from this time period, which is why I'm talking about him. He comes from he was one of the people, I think he was 9 years old when he was part of what's called in Hebrew Gerush Sfarad, or the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. So on second, let's see something here, in case it has to do with class. No. So let's talk about the rise of the anti-Jewish sentiment in the Iberian Peninsula, but especially in what is today modern-day Spain. Let's use World War II and the Nazis as an example here to understand what was going on back then. Joseph Goebbels, every one of these people's names I mentioned, assume they're followed by the words Yamach Shemam, which means may their name be blotted out, like Amalek. Joseph Goebbels, his forte was propaganda. He was like the New York Times. He was the MSNBC of the day. If you get my sarcasm, it's not even sarcasm. He was all about propaganda. You say things, he is famous for saying, you say a lie enough times, it becomes the truth. People start to believe it. And that's what he did. And that's what was happening now back in Spain. They're being portrayed, Jews are being portrayed as exploitative, money grabbers. They were low class. They were dirty people. Wealthy families became targets of envy, making more hostility between neighbors. The Catholic Church, which has a tremendous amount of sins to atone for over the centuries vis-a-vis the Jewish people. And yes, they finally let us off for killing Jesus. I think that was very nice of them. In any case, they I guess the word is propagated, promulgated, I don't know, anti-Semitic narratives, including the old standby of desecration of the Eucharist, the Christian Mass, and communion, blood libels, ritual murder. And that just made the hatred of the Jewish people sound familiar. This is exactly what happened in England. It's the same thing, just 200 years later. And there was an attempt to make uniform religion, i.e., the church and Christianity, the only religion in this part of the world, and through the monarchy, which is part of the other things that are fueling this hatred of the Jews, because you're the other, in quotes, you're different. And during this time, of course, as I mentioned very briefly before, is the Inquisition. So what was the role of the Inquisition? The judges, again, there's a man named Torquemada who oversaw the entire thing, but it was more than just, oh, let's get rid of the Jews. It was much more widespread, much more devious, much more heinous. The procedure was, it was a Catholic judicial procedure, which means that the judges were ecclesiastical judges. Lahavdil, which is an expression which means you can't compare the two, but it's the way we compare them. There's a civil, here we have a civil court in Israel, and you have a Beit Din, a religious court. So the court that was judging people to see if they really were Christian or not was a religious court. It was under the auspices of the Catholic Church. They would investigate cases, they would try cases, and what was the purpose of what we call tribunals? Again, it wasn't just against the Jews, it was to combat heresy. What was heresy? Anything that would go against the church, anything that would go against Jesus. Apostasy, blasphemy, witchcraft. Where did they get the idea in the 1600s in Salem, Massachusetts, that there's witchcraft and all that stuff? Again, just go back. It's only not even 200 years later, and they're literally burning witches at the stake, right? This has been done. This is already done. Been there, done that in Spain. And there are other dangers that the Catholic Church was trying to root out of the people. The overwhelming majority of cases that were brought in front of these ecclesiastical courts consisted of penance. In other words, they were found guilty, depending on their infraction. They had to do some form of penance, what we would call in Hebrew tshuva. That would happen in most cases, but some were unrepentant, whether it was heresy or witchcraft they were accused of, they would be handed over for the application of local law, as they call it in North Korea, re-education camps. Usually that was one of two things, either life imprisonment or, and this might have been a better thing for the person, depending on what life imprisonment would look like, execution. If they were known to be lying, they were allowed to be tortured. That was the rule of the Catholic Church. They could be non-maiming torture, which meant you couldn't make it that the guy couldn't walk or move his hands anymore. He could be tortured, but in order to corroborate evidence, but he was allowed to be tortured. I'm going to read a sentence to you that I got from, I don't remember where I picked this up. It says, its ostensible purpose was to combat heresy in Spain, but in practice, it resulted in consolidating power in the monarchy of the newly unified Spanish kingdom. Its brutal methods led to widespread death and suffering. So what does that really mean in normal English? It's a fancy sentence I picked up from some history book. It meant that if these courts have this power, that no matter who you are, Jew or non-Jew, you're terrified of them. And they're the ones who are running the show. So now the Catholic Church and the king and queen, the new monarchy, has now completely entrenched themselves as the leaders of a unified Spain. It was first, even though it was in 1492, the war is actually over and it's completely unified. It begins in 1478, where I'm talking about the Inquisition. And again, like I say, it first targets the secret Jews, and it spreads out from there. It always starts with the Jews. Again, when you see things happen in Israel, when you first started to see, what's it called? When cars would run over people, for terror attacks, then you see that move to England, to Europe. When you see the stabbing, the knifing intifada, that moved over into Europe. It always starts with us. But to get a good overview picture, let's take a look at what does it mean, the unification of Spain. So again, the Ferdinand, let me put this on the screen now, put the map back up. Share map. Let's go back to the other one. Okay, so Ferdinand, let me get one more thing on my screen. So I have everything in front of me in one place. Okay, Ferdinand is the king of Aragon. Aragon's over here. He's the king of Aragon. Isabella is the king of Castile, next door, over here. King of Castile is here. Aragon is over here. They unify under Catholic rule. Again, when they say Catholic rule, means the church is primary over them, and pushes for religious and political unity, so that the kings and the church all are acting in unison. The final victory over this piece of land down here called Granada, also pronounced in the United States as Grenada, which was Muslim at the time. Remember, this was Christian up here, and down here was Muslim. Now all these become unified, and to rule is known generally as Iberia, which, by the way, is why the Spain's national airline is called Iberia Airlines. Paves the way for the strict enforcement of Catholic orthodoxy. This is one of the big steps in getting that done. Now, what happens, as I mentioned, the Jews are kicked out. The edict is written in March of 1492, and in March to April, May, June, July, 4 months later, the Jews are actually physically removed from the country. It was that or die, and it's Tisha B'Av, and as I said, our dear friend Christopher Columbus is in the port waiting to go. Here's a quick map that shows over time Jews. Here's the 1492 expulsion. They head out to North Africa. They head out towards the area of Italy. They then to Egypt and make their way to other places. They also head that way to the left. They go to Portugal, and they go further than Portugal. They go towards the area of the United States. There's resettlement, but the initial numbers, let me make this bigger and move it over even bigger. There we go. When you look at this, you see 1492 expulsion, settlements of expelled Jews from Iberia and the Ottoman Empire with estimated population of the Ottoman records. Okay, it was Ottoman Empire, but by this point already, it's, of course, we know, under the rule of the Catholic Church. Estimated 60,000 Jews from the Iberian Peninsula over here settled in the Ottoman Empire. Right. So this is now this area is under the Muslims, and they end up here. Now, I want you to look at this map, and if you can give me 1 second. Hold on 1 second, because I forgot to get on my screen, man. Let's use this. Let's see if this is what I want. Yeah. Move this up. Oops. Good. Close this. Let me share this part of the screen. Go back here. Remember that image you just saw, right? Now take a look at this image. This is the extermination camps in mostly, obviously, Eastern Europe and beyond, where Jews were murdered in death camps. So when you look at that other map and you look at this map, It's always a matter of the Jews being forced out, spread out, and something happens. This ties into, for those of you in the Tefillah class or listen to Tefillah on YouTube, this ties into exactly what we talked about last night, Jews being forced out, the concept of kibbutz galuyot, of the ingathering of the exiles. But it's actually jarring to look at this map of this one here, knowing of just even a little bit of the Holocaust history, and this almost looks like, wow, death camps, here they are. Look at the areas they're in, right? So Europe, the numbers obviously are not 6 million, but an estimated 60,000. So that's an interesting percentage. Anyways, what was the decree? No, it's nice. It's fine and good to say, okay, the Jews were thrown out, they had to go. But what exactly was the decree against the Jews? What was told them? What were they told? So first of all, they were given 4 months to sell their property. Sell your property and leave Spain. The emigration was permitted, but they were prohibited from taking anything precious metals, gold, silver out of the country, which also, you know, that many Jews, when they were running from the Nazis, they were disenfranchised as far as their property. They were disenfranchised from their merchandise, from their chattel, and they had to smuggle things out. Sometimes I know that my own family, my mother-in-law's family, she rest in peace, the way they got out of Germany was that they happened to have been very, very wealthy. Bummer. And their wealth is what they bought their freedom to get out of Germany when she was 3 years old. So there's all different numbers of how many Jews actually were thrown out in 1492. The estimates are anywhere from 40,000 to 100,000 Jews. Had this been Germany, you would know exactly. You'd probably 73,104. You'd have an exact number. And again, many Jews converted to Christianity to avoid expulsion. They went to Portugal. They went to North Africa, which was that map I showed you before. They went to the Ottoman Empire. They went to Italy. Now, if you want to tie in Israel history, remember at this time, Israel's under the Ottoman rule, which when we come to Israel and we come to that part of history, we'll remember that this is, you know, Jews are fleeing, whether they come to Israel or not, we're not going to talk about now. They go to Italy, they go to other parts of Europe. Now, the reason it's kind of interesting they go to Italy is because Italy, of course, with the Vatican, is the home of the Catholic Church. But okay, I can't comment on that because I don't know anything more than just saying it's kind of ironic. The Abarbanel, the Abayas. The Abarbanel serves as we're going to talk about him next week, actually in maybe in a couple of weeks. So hang on to that. And please remind me about that. Thank you, Gene, because he plays an important part as well in this story. Probably next week we'll talk about him. So the impact on the communities, the Jewish community is pretty obvious. There's the growth of the diaspora Jew. Instead of being concentrated, let's just use the high number, 100,000 Jews. Now, instead of being in one country under the rule of a king and a queen, now once again they're dispersed. One of the things they took with them, and some still use the language today, is something called Ladino. Ladino is to Spanish as Yiddish is to German. It became a language, like a Judaic version of Spanish. If I hear Ladino, read it, not so much here. If I read Ladino, it's close enough to Spanish that I'll understand quite a bit of it. But you'll find many families still don't have Ladino, especially at a Seder. You'll have I have Machzorim that have Ladino in the Machzor, in the Haggadah. That's used as part of their tradition. That's absolutely been kept within for centuries in many families' traditions. Interestingly enough, Jews get kicked out. What happens to the economy of Spain? Goes downhill. Because what happens is that they may have the land, they may have the gold and silver, but what do they lose? They lost the skilled people, they lost the educated population, they lost the finance population, they lost the trade population, they lost the medicine population. They lost so much when they threw their Jews out. And in a sense, as the Torah says, those who curse the Jews become cursed. The short-term gains of, hey, the Jews are gone, let's take their money and their land, is offset by the long-term devastation to their economy. Let me just, okay, I don't want to be, okay, let me just I'm going to bring this to conclusion with one sentence here. And this will lead us into next week with Rabbi Yosef Karo, Bezrat Hashem. This, I want you to just kind of imagine for a moment a child who is, say, 9 years old, and they live in Poland, and it is 1939. We know that September 1st, 1939, Hitler very, very quickly invades Poland, takes over. So you're 9 years old. You're not. You imagine a child 9 years old and is in Poland, and suddenly Hitler and the Nazis come in, they invade the country, they take over the country, and your parents are smart enough to see that things are getting worse and worse and worse for the Jews. Things get worse, and they're talking soon about putting Jews in certain areas, and then there's the Nuremberg laws, and now all of a sudden they're losing their status as citizens. All these things are starting to happen, and their parents are very fortunate to say, you know what, we got to get out of here. There's something's going to happen here, and they leave. The mark that it makes on you, that person, that 9-year-old child, is going to last for many, many years. It's going to imprint just like it did on the adults. It's going to imprint on the child as well. Rabbi Yosef Karo is 9 years old when he becomes one of those people thrown out of Spain. As a child, he is thrown out under the cloud of the expulsion. It's not clear to me how I will be able to get across how it affected him in his piskei halacha, how he decides the halacha. But I'm going to do a little bit of research on how it did in other areas outside of halacha. And what I'd like to do next week is then to talk about how the tour, which he started at the 4 sections, then morphs into something that becomes known as the Shulchan Aruch, or the Code of Jewish Law, pretty much the be-all and end-all of the basis of modern-day halacha since that time. So that's Bezrat Hashem, what we'll start doing next week. We're going to talk about him. We're going to talk about the Abarbanel also, just a little backtracking into this time because it's important. Thank you, Judy. And Rabbi Yosef Karo, and then that time period will move on from there. Meantime, wish everyone a wonderful evening, and B'sorot Tovos.